Okay, it's going live any second now. You can start whenever you like. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee. I'm Councillor Paul Conlon. I'm the chair. Tonight's topic is the one that's very much in the news of climate change. And we've got, obviously, that's a big topic. We've got a number of speakers tonight doing presentations, so it's quite a full agenda. So I'd like to move on with it promptly, so we've got a chance to do the topic justice. First of all, we've got to go through the formalities of the meeting. So let's get those out of the way. Apologies for absence and substitutions. Have we had any apologies?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair.
Not that you're aware of. Okay. Urgent matters. I don't believe there's any of those. Declarations of interest. Okay, if anyone has one, please speak up now. Okay, none of those. Or any, and there certainly aren't any matters to be considered in private. So minutes. We've got two sets of minutes to consider in this case, because the previous two meetings were quite close together. They were more unusually close together. So it wasn't possible to get the minutes for the first meeting ready in time for the second meeting, but they were, just in case anyone wants to raise this, they were circulated separately to members as soon as they were available, so people have had a chance to consider them. So okay, the first set of minutes, does anyone have any questions on those? That's minutes of the
Yep, nothing, no. Chair. I'm happy to agree them if others are.
Okay, minutes on Tuesday, 28th September. So if everyone is though okay with those, can we approve those?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone. So then there's the minutes of the meeting held on 14th of October. Does anyone have anything to raise on those minutes?
Agreed. No.
Okay, so shall we approve those then?
Yeah, happy to agree those.
Okay, that's great. So those are approved. Let's move on then to the presentations then. Okay, so I'm not going to give. There's a number of speakers.
Sorry, Paul, do you mind? I'm on mute. It's all right if I speak. Just on the minutes and the actions, because I think just one thing, we did agree that some of the things, such as the character study, should be shared with the planning committee in terms of not waiting till the end to share good work that was going on from this committee or that we received. And to my knowledge, we, being on that committee, we haven't had those documents yet. So, and certainly people haven't been updated about the work that is going on here. And I just wondered when that's likely to happen.
Can I help you, Chair?
Yeah, yes, please. Yes, go on, Steve.
Yeah, so publication is imminent. I've just, in fact, spoken to the leader of the council this morning about the timetable for that. So we should have that up on the council's website on or around December the 8th.
It was more, Steve, in terms of decisions that were being made. And I thought we'd agreed at this committee that actually, particularly the planning committee, because of the end date of this being 2024 and quite a long way away, that things that we were all agreeing and sharing should actually be proactively put in front of the planning committee so that they were taking them into account as we go along rather than wait until the very end. And to my knowledge, that hasn't happened. It certainly hasn't come to me.
Chair?
Okay. Well, I think the documents aren't ready yet to share, though, are they? Isn't that the problem?
It's really more about them just being on the website rather than planning committee members taking them into consideration. Maybe it's to discuss on offline, but I thought we did agree that.
Yeah, I think we agreed that there should be some sort of, it should be built into the sort of training and briefings right, for cabinet members. Okay, so perhaps the best thing to do is to take that offline rather than discussing it now. But I guess the answer would be to set up a briefing session for planning committee as soon as those documents are available. That would be, you know, my understanding of what we need to do to implement that recommendation. Okay, so we'll discuss that sort of offline and agree the way ahead. Okay, unless there's any more points on the on the minutes, let's move on to the speakers. So first of all, we've got Joe Mortensen, who's been leading the council's work on the council's own climate change strategy, which, you know, obviously is very important and should really be everything that the council does from now on should really be you know, considered in relation to that climate change strategy. But Joe's better able to explain this to me. So over to you then, Joe, if you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. Yep, that's great. I'm going to share my screen now. I've prepared some slides tonight, so it's good to see everyone. I've had the opportunity to meet many of you before, but as the chair said, I'm Joe Mortensen. I lead on climate action for the council. I've been with the council for several years, and my role, just like sort of the face of climate change, has evolved over time. And now I'm leading the implementation of our climate and ecological emergency strategy. So as you can see on this first screen, I think it's just important to take pause for a moment and understand what our commitment is as a council. So we have made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2030, and our declaration commits us to addressing both production and consumption emissions, carbon emissions, which is quite an enormous task. Our strategy focuses primarily on what are considered production emissions, and I will talk about that on the next slide just in a little more detail. There we go. So what I mean by production emissions is a shorthand for that is all of the carbon that is emitted in the borough boundaries. So this is typically due to the burning of fossil fuels. And so we see this coming into three primary categories for the borough. We have transport making up almost a third of those carbon emissions. We have our the way we heat our homes and our hot water coming in at nearly 40% of that, and industry and commercial rounding off the last 30%, 33%. It brings us to about 1 million tons of CO2 emitted annually within the borough. So that's, if we divided that equally, it would be about 3.2 tons per person each year. If we had a graph that showed sort of where we've come from, we would see that these numbers are coming down, which is really good news. But we don't want to take too much credit for that ourselves, because what's actually happening is our national electricity grid is decarbonizing very rapidly, which is wonderful. But that's causing sort of a our own carbon footprint to appear to be coming down, when the reality is the actions that we're taking would be demonstrated in a much less dramatic way. So we've got a lot of work to do. And as I said in the first slide, we've got the consumed emissions has also been one of our targets. And consumed emissions, I don't have a slide on this one, but they're sort of the emissions that are made up of everything in our lives. So every material object that you have represents carbon emissions that had to go into the manufacture, transport, packaging, and disposal of that item. And so we've got estimates that have been done by Leeds University for the whole of the UK, and the consumed emissions for our borough are over 2 million tons. So in total, we're looking at something like 3 million tons of CO2 annually between produced and consumed. So we have a lot of work to do on the consumed side, but London as a whole is definitely looking at this as well. One of the most sort of fertile places for that is around waste reduction and waste minimization and circular economy. So you'll see a lot of opportunities there, and maybe that's something to contemplate for the plan as well. Sorry, my slides aren't responding very quickly. There we go. The way we developed the plan, I'm just going to go through this. Our own strategy for the climate and ecological emergency is very quickly. We looked at what we control, so our own council buildings and activities. And we looked at what we could directly influence, which is where planning has a major role to play here. So we look at planning policies, procurement, finance, legal actions that we have, and our staff who make up about 2,000 employees in the borough, double that if you include the school. So that's our sphere of direct influence. And then finally, we've looked at what is our indirect influence. So our audiences that maybe we could do behavior change campaigns for, or offer some technical assistance for, but maybe don't have a direct sort of influence over the way that they're making decisions. So we looked at those three areas. Our plan focuses primarily on what we control and what we directly influence. We connected the climate strategy to as many pieces of work that were happening across the council. And we continue to do this, I should say, because this is a live document ongoing. So you can see a local plan turns up here, but it comes through and hopefully will continue to come through even more strongly across all of the various strategies and big pieces of work that the council is doing. We've ended up with 15 strategic objectives within the climate strategy that I've put on this slide here. So hopefully they're quite memorable. We've made them bite-sized for each of the 5 themes that we have. So we're focusing up on energy, food, nature, travel, and waste, as you can see on the slide here in front of you. And I'll let you have a look through the 3 objectives for each. But these 3 objectives are sort of what I like to describe as where we need our boat to keep pointing towards. And we have targets that sit underneath these objectives that help us get to this point. And then we can't forget the enabling functions that we have. Again, planning listed here, procurement and finance, very important. So just ever so briefly to speed through and give you some ideas for connecting back to the strategy and the local plan work that you're doing. With energy, we really see retrofitting as being a major undertaking for really the next 30-year horizon. And it's absolutely essential that our local plan, as far as possible, demands that our residents and business owners make buildings suitable and fit for the future. We also see retrofitting as a tool for regeneration of communities, and also will help us contribute to the green economy and that sort of emerging opportunity to create jobs and skills. In our nature theme, we see the protection and enhancement of open spaces as key priorities. Once land is gone, and developed over, it's never coming back. So it's really critical that we are valuing those resources and making sure that we are that we are, to the greatest degree possible, protecting and enhancing what we have left in the borough. We saw more than ever during COVID that the open spaces really did tremendous things for our mental health. We saw lots of people getting involved in really contributing to their communities and connecting with other people by going out and giving to these open spaces, whether that was litter picking or, you know, biodiversity or food growing. And we also see the opportunity for creating urban resilience through nature. So looking at, for instance, floodwater defenses and stormwater, ways of handling stormwater can be really beautiful, and they can also create habitat, as well as being probably some of the most inexpensive solutions for the future flooding activity that we may see. Our travel theme really focuses in on our need to create communities where active travel is the #1 choice that our residents and businesses make in terms of when they think about making a journey within the borough, or even beyond borough boundaries, of course. And so what we're really hoping to do is shift as many possible journeys as we can to active travel. So that's walking, scooting, cycling, and reducing the number of vehicles that are traveling in and through the borough. And then finally, as a last resort, any vehicles that are required, because there will be some essential journeys required by vehicle, but we decarbonize those and provide the infrastructure so that others can make the choice to decarbonize their journey. And by that, I mean electric vehicles or perhaps hydrogen-powered heavy vehicles. In the waste theme, the big win here is dealing with food waste and making sure that we have the infrastructure so that we are, #1, not creating food waste in the first place. So that's more of a behavior change side of things. But when we do have food waste, it's inevitable that there will be some things that you can't eat on that plate. And so we need a responsible way of disposing of that. And we have right now the infrastructure in place in Ealing, and we've done quite well at that. It's more about connecting the people to using that infrastructure on a much more robust basis. And we also see that the circular economy elements coming through really strongly in this waste section as well, and really trying to examine how we can and what role we can play as a local authority in building the circular economy for Ealing. So just moving into my last bit here, we tried to map a few of the strategic opportunities of the C's, the climate strategy. So we really saw strong links around, as you've heard me say, the green economy, the local plan, ensuring that we deliver zero carbon buildings, and climate justice. And you'll sort of hear that those also chime with the priorities of the council in many, many ways. So what we see in terms of the local plan is it's the real opportunity to really sculpt a low carbon future for the borough. And so I would recommend to the panel that we really give some deep consideration to, you know, what the massive impact that the policies that are being created right now could have, and how transformative they could have around really creating a resilient place, and a place that's fit for the future of what we will see happening in our communities because of climate change, and making sure that we don't lose sight that the climate emergency really does go hand in hand with the ecological emergency, and knowing that, you know, without biodiversity, without nature, humans don't have a chance. So it's really important, particularly in urban areas, that we're really protecting and enhancing those wherever possible. With zero carbon buildings, just diving into this a little bit more, the opportunities are more than just the buildings themselves, which will be, you know, amazing in terms of carbon reduction, carbon emissions reduction, but also, you know, from a health and well-being standpoint, from a job creation standpoint, and as I said, the possibility of regenerating areas through retrofit efforts. And then a quick slide on the green economy, which the UK Treasury has now, you know, suggested that that net zero carbon emissions and a net zero economy by 2050 is essential for long-term prosperity in the UK. So Treasury has clocked that that this is a real essential force, and there's no more sort of hiding from how big of a force Mother Nature is in all sectors. And there are some real opportunities for us to grow and nurture the green economy within Ealing and build the recovery plan that we have, the Ealing's plan for good jobs, and bring that all together as an expression of sustainability and climate action. And finally, just the opportunities around climate justice and bringing equalities and equity through all the decision making that and really understanding the impacts of all the decision making that we have that are sort of brought into the local planning process, and making sure that we're addressing equity and fuel poverty and health and race and all of those things with how we are evaluating policies so that it's really truly for the good of all of our communities. So that is my slide deck, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone that would be helpful to this discussion.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Do I have any questions to Joe? If you want to ask a question, can you put your hand up either in the either on the screen or in the participants screen? Did I see Councillor? Yeah, okay. But Councillor Shaw wants to ask a question, and did you want to ask a question too, Councillor Burke?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay,
I was just interested, Joe, in the bits. Obviously, I think the bit that's particularly relevant for this committee as well tonight, just in terms of the planning and where we're looking at that. The sort of, could you just expand a little bit for us about sort of new build and zero carbon building works where it's possible, and what can be done? Obviously you mentioned retrofitting. Retrofitting more of the stock of housing is terrific. Obviously some demolition will take place, but there's often the discussion now about the existing carbon that's within buildings, and how demolition might be avoided in the future, and how that could work. I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit more on that, please.
Sure. I would definitely look to my planning colleagues to come in and support if you have further information as well. So you're right, it is twofold. I mean, one is to make sure that we're not creating a pipeline of homes that need to be retrofit, through the planning process. So any new home that's built really does need to adhere to the London Plan standard of becoming a zero carbon home. I think it's we have those policies currently on our books, and there are penalties where developers don't reach those targets, and I think that there's an ongoing discussion and a rather strong opinion that the penalty really isn't persuasive enough, and so our plans are to do something about that, to strengthen that incentive to deliver on these zero carbon homes, because there's just really no sense in creating homes that will just need to be retrofit in 20 years anyway. So that kind of takes care of the new build in some ways, and we're also seeing a lot of evidence that that talks about the cost comparison between developing at a zero carbon standard and versus sort of what we're seeing come through as sort of a typical building regulation standard, because they do differ. And the estimates are somewhere between sort of 4 and 5% increase to deliver a zero carbon home. And that will depend on the scale of development. But the point I'm trying to make with that statement is that when we hear that it's financially infeasible to deliver zero carbon homes, it's just probably not grounded in evidence, or potentially they've looked at it too late in the game. So it's really important that our development community understands that is the commitment that Ealing has made from basically day zero of thinking about building homes in our borough. And in terms of retrofitting, you're right. I had a conversation with Steve just last week about, what type of instruments we might be able to bring into the local plan around retrofitting, because it is trickier, because a lot of it is permitted development. And so, most of it is probably permitted development. So it will rely more so on sort of the will of the people and the knowledge of the people and the access to good information around making that choice, rather than potentially planning policy. But we are looking for different ways to see if there are some hooks to make sure that we see those retrofits happening at pace as well. Is that getting to your question, or was there more that you wanted me to?
No, I think it is. I think you've covered everything there in as much detail as I think we've got time for tonight. We could go on and on about it, but
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe we could touch upon this in some of the other presentations as well, as it's relevant to the, to a number of the other presentations. Okay, well, I've got 3 more people that want to ask questions that I can see. So I can see Councillor Ball, Councillor Burke, and Councillor Woodruff. So I'll just ask them to do their questions, and that's it, I think, unless anyone else wants to come in. So Councillor Ball.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it follows on from Councillor Shaw's question, really. Is it possible to make development carbon neutral, taking into account the carbon effect of demolishing the previous building, which we don't normally include, because the owners of the site can generally demolish it without permission, so we kind of tend to exclude that.
Right. Okay. Yep. That is the part that I wasn't able to touch on. You're right. I mean, so the idea of emissions that are sort of locked in, they're embodied in a building, is a question, and something that I know that we'll be doing some exploration on through this planning process as well. I would say, I would say that every site will be unique, and that it takes quite a detailed analysis to calculate how much carbon is embodied in a building that you may be demolishing. And so I would say that we would need to rely on, if we wanted to consider those emissions as well, we would probably need to rely on some sort of an offset, a carbon offset for that, or looking at buildings that are actually carbon positive or carbon negative, depending on sort of what language you're using or terminology you're using, where you're actually producing energy that goes back to the grid from your very efficient home, which is an emerging design standard that we're seeing happen, but not very often. But that is the future as well. But for this very moment, I would say it's considering the embodied carbon of a building that needs to come down for a site to be ready for development when it's being redeveloped. I don't think we have a lot of sort of case studies or sort of best practice on that just yet. But if my planning colleagues know of other councils that are leading the way on this, I haven't heard of anyone sort of grasping this nettle just yet, because it's quite complex.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, can I ask the planning people here to note this and come back and deal with this topic in their presentation later on, if that's possible. Okay, Councillor Burke.
So again, sort of on the same theme, Joe, really. I mean, at the moment, I think we are currently approving buildings that are not carbon neutral. I think that's happening. So I don't know if you know the answer to this, or if you could point us in the direction of where we can find the answer to this. How do we make sure that, people like myself as councillors and the officers in pre-planning are really making this clear to developers that we will no longer approve anything that isn't carbon neutral? And again, you might not know the answer to this. What are our powers in terms of other policies that seem to contradict this, in terms of you need more housing, therefore this goes lower down on the list? So, if we really want to stick to our guns on this, if you don't know the answer, do you know, could you direct us in the area into somebody who might know the answer about what powers we've got to insist with developers that we will no longer be approving of buildings and making sure planning committee follows through?
Yes, so I don't have an exact answer for you, but you are correct that we are not seeing net zero homes or zero carbon homes being delivered with regularity in the borough or indeed across London. The policy mechanism does give them a sort of a get out clause where they can pay for the shortfall of carbon emissions. And as I said, the instrument right now is quite dull even. And we've got a paper that was attached to this agenda pack where we participated in a study with 5 other boroughs so that we could sort of rebalance that and make the incentive much stronger. So that is one of the policy instruments that we do need to push through with so that it becomes not just an easy out for developers to choose to not build to that standard, but it really pushes them to do their homework and make these developments at the standard that we're expecting. But I do understand that it is, there are often trade-offs through the entire process. So I think one of my planning colleagues would probably be better placed with to illuminate that sort of negotiation side of your question.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And finally, Councillor Woodruff.
Yeah, I sort of took my hand down because it's more or less been covered by the other questions. It's just so presumably we'll get some information from the planning department as to what the current situation with regard to new builds is, whether how strict it is and what's possible and what isn't, and presumably that they will respond at some point. I'm presuming.
Yes, so there is that they have got a slot for a presentation later on. So I'm hoping that they're noting these points down and we'll respond to them in their presentation as well. Okay, thanks very much then, Joe. Okay, we'll crack on then to the next presentation. So next we have Felicity Cole. I think Felicity is from Arup, and you're going to tell us about the what do they call, the integrated
impact assessment.
Integrated impact assessments, that's it. So I mean, I don't know what one of those is, I must admit, so hopefully you're going to tell us and how they're relevant to the local plan. So off you go then, please, Felicity.
Absolutely. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Brilliant. So thank you, Chair. As you said, my name's Felicity Cole. I'm an environmental consultant from Arup and project manager of the integrated impact assessment that we're doing for the Ealing local plan. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of exactly what that means and what it involves. There we go. So an integrated impact assessment is a regulatory requirement that all local plans need to carry out. You might hear people refer to sustainability appraisal or strategic environmental assessment, but essentially the integrated approach covers everything. And it's an assessment of the impacts of the local plan on various environmental and social topics. There's 2 kind of main phases associated with the integrated impact assessment. So firstly, the assessment team helping to shape the local plan as it develops, so seeking to reduce negative impacts and increase potential benefits. And then the next stage is naturally actually doing the assessment. So that's where we look at the potential impacts of the local plan, and we'll look at impacts on the environment, on equalities, and on health and well-being. So I'm just going to talk through kind of both of these 2 steps. So firstly, on to shaping. So throughout the development of the local plan, the assessment team will test and challenge the plan proposals. So we'll be there as kind of a critical friend, challenging the plan development process and seeking to, as I said before, increase benefits and decrease potential negative impacts as a result of the plan implementation. So trying to have a really positive input and embed sustainable principles into the plan. Ultimately, we want the impact assessment to not just be a report at the end. We want it to be a really positive process that really helps inform the local plan development. To do this, we are proposing workshops with the local plan making team. So the assessment team will be there again to challenge and test the plan as it develops, and we'll do these during key stages of the plan making process, such as when we develop the options or when the development of some of the key policy areas. As part of our assessment, we'll also be providing written feedback throughout the assessment process. So it's an iterative assessment, and we're again providing those recommendations and helping to shape the plan. And as I said, having that positive influence and not just making it a report at the end, but a process that really helps embed sustainable principles into the plan making process. So in terms of the actual assessment, this is where we describe the potential impacts of the implementation of the local plan. So we will do an assessment of kind of every aspect of the local plan. So we will assess growth options, we'll assess each individual policy, and we'll assess each individual site allocation. We will consider a range of impacts on environmental, health, social topics. So just to kind of give you an overview, if we had an example, for example, a policy about affordable housing, we would review that policy and ask various questions. Does the policy improve mental health and well-being? Does it meet current and future housing need? Does it promote sustainable forms of transport? Does it improve educational attainment? Does it ensure resilience to climate change? So there's a big wide range of topics. This isn't exhaustive. There's topics covering environment, social, economic aspects, and we will assess as I said, every kind of element of the local plan to understand what those potential impacts might be. Following this quite detailed assessment, we'll produce a report, and that's published alongside the iterations of the local plan. The reports can be quite weighty. As I just said, there's a lot of assessment to undertake. So we'll also be doing there'll also be a non-technical summary alongside that report, which will just provide a high-level overview of the main findings of our assessment. The integrated impact assessment, like the local plan, is also subject to consultation. So essentially, when there's an iteration of the local plan, accompanying that will be an integrated impact assessment report that anyone is welcome to comment on. So that is it. It was a very just short kind of high level overview. We do have a scoping report, and this is where we describe our methodology and the approach that I've just very briefly gone over with you there. That will be published this side of Christmas. So if people were after more details or wanted to comment on our approach, that will be consulted on and will be on the council's website. But I'm happy to take any questions or queries you might have now. Appreciate that was a very kind of light touch process of what is quite a detailed and iterative assessment. But thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, thanks, Felicity. Yep. Do any members have any questions on that? Councillor Shaw, do you have a question?
I do, yes. Thanks, Chair. Thanks for that, Felicity. Just out of interest, in the overall assessment there, you can see the number of policies actually that are being drawn together in the useful sort of second chart that you showed us. Now, obviously, it does have to cover a lot. So would your assessment necessarily be, this is how your local plan scores against this and whether it's fit for purpose and so on? And how would that scoring change? So for example, in terms of here is your need for delivering housing and affordable housing, obviously that's going to score highly in terms of policy, and especially for us as policymakers. But what if that's traded off against some of the more environmental concerns? I suppose what I'm really asking is, where do the environmental concerns and the carbon, becoming carbon neutral, if you like, in development and through our planning process in the local plan, how embedded is it, and how highly does it score against the competing policies that we'll be having to make, and ultimately as decision makers, we'll be taking those decisions in the future?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So we have quite an extensive, as I showed on the slide, lots of topics to cover. So we have an extensive assessment framework with about 13 different environmental, social topics, and we assess we would assess every single policy individually against that. So that does mean, like you said, a housing policy will score well for housing because the objective is it providing housing, but it might not score well for other topics where if potentially there was building on kind of ecological sites, it might not score so well for environmental related objectives. So we do assess everything individually. So it does mean the way the assessment is also done is essentially a score of red, amber, green, quite simple. Is it a positive effect? Is it having a negative effect? And then we provide some justification around why we've given it that scoring. So in some cases, it won't score positively for some of the objectives because it naturally can't. If the policy is basically doing the opposite of what the objective says, but it will score positive in other aspects. So there is an element of weighing up. It's there to be independent. It's there to set out exactly what the impacts are. It's not there to try and like hide impacts or justify impacts. It's there to simply state this is a potential impact of implementing this policy. However, there will obviously be other impacts associated with implementing other policies alongside that. So yeah, as I say, you might just naturally have some negative scoring, but it's designed to be independent and to kind of provide that critical analysis of the potential impacts.
Yeah, so effectively, sorry, Chair, if I can just come back, effectively, it'll provide us as the decision makers with an independent tool by which we can then make the judgments of how the scores are and how we then want to apply the policies as needed. It won't make any judgment by itself.
No, it's there to almost be an evidence-based tool. It's to inform decision making. It's not there to make decisions. It's there to provide that independent review. Again, like I said, we also assess the growth options. It's not there to choose which option is better. It's there to provide an independent review of what we think the impacts are for each potential impacts are for each of those options. Yeah,
good. Thanks, Felicity.
Okay. I don't see any more hands up.
Linda's hands up.
Oh, sorry, Linda. I do see Linda's now. Okay, Councillor Burke, go ahead. Yeah.
I think what you're saying is that it hasn't really got any teeth in terms of requiring us to do anything, but I'm happy to stand corrected. But I did wonder if it's got any teeth in other ways in terms of, is it likely that this would be benchmarked and there could be reputational risk to us, or it could be used by external bodies to say, and will it be public?
So it is public. It's all subject to consultation alongside the local plan, and we are required to consult with statutory bodies on the report. It has teeth in terms of it is, so I won't get into detail kind of regulations, but there are 2 regulatory requirements behind it, associated with 2 sets of different legislation to do with local plan development. So it does form part of the kind of aspect of, does the local plan has it met this basic legal requirements? So during the examination, it's usually one of the first kind of things that's considered, and there's various aspects we have to look at. So we have to demonstrate that we've clearly assessed options and that we've done a robust assessment of the local plan. So it has teeth in that kind of sense that it is important, it is necessary, and it will be consulted on, and it will be subject to examination as well. But as I was talking about kind of shaping the local plan, often it can just be a report at the end that is delivered, and we are trying to make it have a bit more teeth in the sense that our assessment team is trying to have that positively influence and testing and challenging the plan as it's developing. We'd rather kind of make suggestions and make recommendations to change the policies so the impact, so the scoring is more positive at the end, rather than just simply having it a negative score. So teeth in terms of regulatory aspects, but also us as a team are aiming to have that positive influence during the plan making process.
Okay, thanks very much, Felicity. Unless there's anyone else has a question, then we'll move on, shall we? Okay, thanks, Felicity. Then the next speaker is Trevor Sharman from Ealing Transition. So Ealing Transition is a local community group, as having Ealing in their name implies, and they've worked on a number of projects around the borough that have contributed towards reducing climate emissions, and I'm sure Trevor will be able to tell us about a few of those. So okay, Trevor, if when you're ready, please start.
Right. Hopefully you can see my screen, my slide screen.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
It should come. Ah, voila, good. Okay, well, thank you for your invitation to Ealing Transition to address you today about the local plan. So I'm Trevor Sharman. I'm a member of the steering group of Ealing Transition Initiative, which has been active in the local community over the past 12 years, raising awareness of climate concerns through public meetings, talks, films, and open space community planning events. Our view is that by taking action where we are within our local community, we can empower ourselves and influence others around us to act and to press for effective action against climate disruption. We've helped initiate and support a number of practical projects locally, which are contributing to reducing climate disruption and restoring natural systems. The local plan is being considered in the light of an unprecedented global threat from climate damage. Ealing Council recognised this in April 2019 when you unanimously passed a declaration of a climate emergency. We've been working with Ealing Council since then to develop effective plans and actions to meet the targets for carbon pollution reduction and nature restoration in order to contribute to the requirements to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which catastrophic impacts are predicted. So the local plan needs to be a plan to address the climate emergency too. So already for the UK, the predictions are for hotter, drier summers and heat waves. For winter, heavier and more extreme rainfall leading to flooding. We can look at the example of Western Canada at the moment for some of the extremes that are happening in Northern Hemisphere countries. Very dramatic there. Global impacts will inevitably affect our food and energy supplies, given our high dependency on imports. And we can also expect even more strain on our public services. So there are two levels of action. Mitigation, which is really what policy has been aimed at so far, which is reducing the drivers of climate damage, particularly the carbon dioxide and methane emissions. But then there's also adaptation, which is managing the negative impacts that have already happened. And some of those, it's too late to mitigate. We do also need to address adaptation, and the plan needs to think about this. So the practical steps needed, as we've heard from Jo in her presentation, is to reduce carbon pollution, and particularly from buildings. One assumes that that's going to be a focus for the building area, or the building and development is a key focus for the local plan. So we already have the technology to do this. Passive house standards, which is the German name for zero emissions, is used across Europe. It is possible to retrofit to passive house standards. One of our members has done it to her 1930s semi-detached ex-council house. And passive house standards means that it needs no heating system. So it remains warm from passive solar heat and daily activities within the home. It costs more, and again, but fairly modestly more, it would seem, than new buildings that we're currently building, but it does mean much lower costs and emissions for the lifetime of the building. So it's clearly important that we actually address future carbon pollution in this way by reducing emissions to zero, which is entirely feasible from buildings. Travel in the London plan, it's already setting a target for 80% of journeys to be by public transport, cycle or on foot by 2041. And the local plan should certainly enhance these targets for the health of us all. We will need to manage weather impacts, and the adaptation to that we need to do, the simplest thing is to use nature's systems, which are the most effective and appropriate and cost-effective ways of doing this. So rewilding natural areas with greater and varied vegetation cover enables much higher rain absorption and therefore flood prevention. So that means that green spaces, public and private of all kinds, have an enormous strategic value for the safety of our community and must be preserved for natural weather management, as well as obvious biodiversity restoration. We think that the focus of the plan should be a long-term influence over the development of, it will have a long-term development over the development of Ealing, but we think that the focus should be on community. So you need long-term thinking. This plan, I think, is due to be finalised in 2023 and maybe used for up to 20 years into the future. But you've got some inspirations here. Charles Jones was the Ealing Borough Surveyor for 50 years. I'm not sure many people will make that target now, but he was responsible in his planning thoughts at that time for the wonderful street trees, parks and open spaces and community buildings that make Ealing the positive place it is. In Wales, the government has passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, passed in 2015, and they have a Future Generations Commissioner to advise on the impact of actions of on all the actions of the government on future generations. Your role as the architects of the local plan compares with these past and present custodians of our community well-being. So your community, our community, must be the primary beneficiaries of this plan. So to do this, we need to focus on community resilience. Our communities are going to come under considerable pressure. This plan needs to help enable and resource community resilience in order for local people to manage and adapt to challenging futures, not least from climate change. Focusing on local communities will provide the best resources for this adaptation. And I raise here the concept of the 15-minute city. This means the intention of this is that everyone would live within 15 minutes of community facilities and resources, even in large cities. And this is already being recognized by other European cities named there as being the defining principle for their future planning. There are 6 essential functions they're talking about here within the 15 minutes: living, working, commerce, healthcare, education, and entertainment. Interestingly, current drivers are at work pushing us towards this way of living. So particularly relating to COVID. So far more working from home, less commuting, much more online retailing, so less travel for that. The impact of artificial intelligence, which is only just beginning to become manifest. So moving towards the 15-minute city also has many co-benefits, particularly the accessibility of support, mutual support, more easily shared resources, and a more time and energy efficient way of living, plus of course less pollution. It also means that it's helpful to build with the community rather than for. So the local plan needs to fully develop an awareness of the change dynamics that are underway at the moment, not just climate, but some of the things I've just mentioned. There needs to be support for community initiatives, current and future. And there needs to be, we need to enable wide public engagement and involvement in the planning process. So is this idea of community real? I would say yes, and I can show you, but we have imagination in our community, and imagination that has been put into action. So in terms of energy, here we have a photo of West Acton School, where the Ealing Transition Solar Schools project helped install a major PV service for the school. This is the 18th, is one of 18 schools and children's centres so far in Ealing that have had solar panels installed. This reduces the cost of energy to schools by something like 20 to 30%. It's funded by the local community through cooperative investment, and of course is cutting carbon emissions for all. In terms of building, in terms of zero carbon building, this is the Bluebell Centre in Perivale Wood, made by the Selborne Society. It's a straw bale building, probably the only one in Ealing, but it's a low energy build and built by volunteers. This is community action around food. Horsenden Farm Community Interest Company is engaging the local community in food growing and learning. And here, nature restoration in action, the Ealing Transition Community Forest Garden, where there's nature restoration, also a community orchard and wild play area for children to learn about being in nature. And finally, Act for Ealing, which is emerging now, building connection through a community-led networking hub to share information and enable wide access to climate action in our community. So there's a lot going on in your community. Your community is doing a lot, using its imagination and acting together. So in summary, with the community as your customer, the local plan needs to be relevant for the climate emergency, including the urgency of that. It needs to address mitigation, address adaptation, needs to focus on building community resilience, and needs to partner with community imagination. And as I've said, I think time is short, but we need to remember that the consequences of our decisions will be with us for a long time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Trevor. Right, does anyone have any questions or any points they'd like to make on anything that was covered there?
Yeah, Chair, quickly,
Okay, Councillor Mahmood, yeah, go ahead.
I understand that the great work the Ealing Transitions are doing, but I'm trying to relate what we are discussing in terms of planning and the local plan. So is there any priority or any top recommendation you will suggest us to do, adopt in coming future?
Well, I hope there's a number of key points there, which are that instead that the focus should be on whatever the plan is delivering is creating resilience in the local community to deal with adaptation. So not a fixed plan, but enabling the community itself to be adaptable, and also our environment to be adaptable. As I've said, we've heard about biodiversity, but in fact, we know that the climate will be very problematic, particularly in terms of flooding risk, in terms of heat waves. These are major impacts on our community, and it is possible to plan to address those in advance, particularly by using and enabling nature to address those problems with us. So shade trees, for instance, are very significant in reducing the impact of heat waves in urban areas. We've got lots of them, but we clearly will need more. As I've said, in terms of the heavier rainfall that is forecast for our part of the world, for the ground to absorb it and for it not to become flooding, damaging our property, we need to have rewilded those open areas that we have, and I'm saying private and publicly owned, in order for that absorption of water, rainwater, to happen. So you could say that there's a key point there, that the plan needs to preserve open space, but also limit the use of open space, private or public, in order to ensure that it is available as an asset to absorb extreme weather events. So a few bits there.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. Okay, well, Trevor has to sort of leave fairly shortly, I believe. So, if you want the benefit of his expertise, it's best to get it now. So,
sorry, Chair, could I just come in?
yes, okay. Okay, Councillor Manro, yes, go ahead then.
Can I say I really welcome your presentation, and I do think some of these issues have been taken on board, especially the issue around having Ealing not being a dormitory town and moving towards the whether you call it the 15-minute city or the 20-minute city. I mean, there are some issues around what number you use, but this is something that we've been looking at, and I think the local plan will flesh that out in terms of how we're looking at creating really good jobs in the borough so that people can actually live, work, and have access to all the facilities they need in the borough, rather than, I think before COVID, we had this idea around Crossrail and all the rest of it, of people just translating through Ealing into central London. I think that there has been a reassessment of that kind of transport issues and how people would sort of get to work. And I think we'd rather have people coming in from Maidenhead and whatever into Ealing Broadway and working in Broadway rather than going into central London. So some of those issues that you raised actually are very much on our agenda, creating more green space in a borough, looking at how we use land, employment land, and housing land, but actually a balance between housing and employment. And I think that's something that we are seriously looking at and looking to change some of the issues that were there from before. So I really welcome your presentation. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to hear some of what you said. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have anything else that they want to add anything at this point, or want to ask any questions while Trevor's here? Okay. Doesn't look like it unless someone sort of shouts out. Okay, thanks very much then, Trevor.
I'll say farewell to you and good luck for everything.
Okay, and that's great. So thanks for all the sort of work that you're doing and so forth. And so I hope that's given people some food for thought. Okay. Okay. We'll move on to the next presentation then. Which is okay. So we've got one of our own planning people to do the next presentation. That's Ian Week. So over to you then, Ian. So yeah, you're going to tell us how the local plan is going to deal with some of these issues that we've talked about. So whenever you're ready, please start.
Chair.
Okay, sorry, Steve, is it? Yeah. Hello, Steve.
Chair.
Yeah, Steve Barton. Yeah, is Ian
Chair,
here?
we're having some technical problems. Sorry, Chair, we're having some technical problems. So we seem to have lost Ian. So I'm going to try and step in if I can, but I'm also having technical problems. So I hope you can hear me.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can certainly hear.
So I'm going to try and step in. If Sever could run the slides for me, please. I'm afraid he's dropped out of the call. We've got. Oh, you are there. Sorry, I'll step back. Sorry.
Okay. I can see a slides on the screen now.
I think that's me, Steve, sharing the slides. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'll step in. So apologies,
Steve,
it's not Ian Week, it's Steve Barton, Strategic Planning Manager. So okay, so if we can have the next slide, please, Sarah. So this sets out the sort of legislative framework in which the policy making detail, but suffice to say that the NPPF, whilst requiring the planning system to shape places, in ways that contribute to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't actually set any specific metric. So we're left to do that ourselves within the context of the local plan. Next slide, please. The London plan does significantly better, and there is a suite of policies which deal with climate action. And just to make the point, as I always do at these more development plan, and indeed any emerging local plan policies must be in general conformity with the London plan. That doesn't mean that we have to entirely slavishly follow those. If we have an evidence base which suggests that we could do something different, then that would be permissible. And certainly that was very much what happened in relation to energy targets that we set in our current adopted local plan. The London plan set some very stretching targets. We decided they weren't stretching enough, and we set more stringent targets in our local plan, and we were able to produce and prepare an evidence base to justify that approach. Arguably, the London plan now has perhaps caught up with where we are with our current London plan, and probably gone a local plan and gone beyond. And my hope and expectation with member level support is we will once again leapfrog ahead of the London plan and set more challenging target. And where the climate action agenda is set out in the London plan is obviously in the introductory section, which deals with the overarching vision and objectives of the plan, in what is known as a set of principles around good growth. And I would certainly associate good growth as being green growth. That's in chapter 1. Chapter 8 deals with the whole issue of green infrastructure and greening, biodiversity, and protection of our trees and woodlands. We're not going to cover this topic in any great detail today, because your next meeting in the LDAP cycle in December the 16th, is specifically going to look at green infrastructure. And we've got some really good speakers lined up to talk about, in particular, urban and how that policy has evolved over time. Next slide, please. The bulk of the policies of central import to our discussion today, and certainly which have provided the context for many of the other contributions this evening, is in chapter 9 around sustainable net zero carbon targets, carbon offsetting, etc., as well as energy, heat risk, waste, flood risk management, and sustainable development. And whilst again it's not the subject or focus of tonight's discussion, we shouldn't forget chapter 10, transport. And certainly transport is a significant driver in terms of greenhouse gases, and the management of more sustainable forms of transport is absolutely key to any future strategy, as Joe Mortensen said right at the beginning. And the last meeting in our cycle of this current cycle of LDAP meetings will be focusing very much on the concept of the 20-minute, 15-minute neighbourhood, and the importance therefore of active travel arrangements to reduce the carbon emissions of transport as a sector. Next slide, please. My apologies, I think I'm getting a time delay in terms of things changing on my screen. In terms of the emerging local plan, there are 3 cross-cutting themes of them, but be aware the other two really important cross-cutting themes relate to inclusive growth and particularly conscious of where we've been in the last 18 months or so, health and well-being. They will be golden threads throughout the plan. And as Felicity very eloquently described, one of the tools at our disposal for testing to the extent to which our emerging policy suite is meeting our objectives around climate action and indeed these other key themes, is this concept of strategic environmental assessment and sustainability, an integrated approach which not only deals with sustainability appraisal, deals with the equality impacts and health impacts of the plan. And just picking up on the question which I heard from Councillor Burke earlier, this is a really useful tool because it enables us to be able to test whether or not the suite of policies we bring forward enhance our objectives around climate action, or where they are obviously in conflict, whether or not there are mitigation strategies that we should consider. So if you like, view that whole toolkit as a bit of a critical friend, and the fact that we've got consultants to do that, so it's separated from the local plan team, further embeds that in the process so that we have the opportunity to appraise draft local plan making at reports, will find their way into the public domain. They will be published alongside the local plan, and indeed will be the subject of forensic examination by the independent inspector when we get to the public inquiry stage after we've submitted the plan to the Secretary of State. Next slide, please. So the next few slides attempt to summarize how local plan can help with our response to climate action. What are the sorts of suites of policies, issues that we can tackle legitimately with real effect and meaning through the local plan. So land use and travel is something I've already highlighted. It's obviously a key area, but obviously ensuring that we optimize the use of land so that we can ensure more sustainable patterns of development and land use, directing development sustainable nations. Often those will be the ones which are the ones with the greatest connectivities, though transport modes or others which are in close proximity to
Okay, I think we can only hear about half of what you're
town
saying.
centres, and delivering patterns of land use which reduce car dependence and facilitate shorter, more regular trips.
Chair, the sound is breaking.
Walking and cycling. So that is the concept in a nutshell of the 20-minute neighbourhood. And also increasing the sustainability.
Chair, we can't hear anything.
Yeah, can't hear anything at all now. I don't know if Steve is still disappeared.
I think we've lost him. I can't see him on the call.
Oh dear. Okay. Better give him a couple of minutes in case he reappears. Hello, Steve. Are you there?
Hello, can you hear me again?
I can. Yes.
Okay.
We weren't hearing you very well even before you dropped out.
My apologies, committee. I'll try and persevere for a bit longer. Seva, can we move 2 slides forward, please? Thank you. So another area where the local plan will be hopefully effective in meeting the challenges around climate action is around nature and adaptation. And Trevor was giving some really excellent examples of the sorts of schemes that may well help contribute. And so clearly air quality is a key factor. So ensuring that schemes contribute to improved air quality where possible, or avoid exposure to unacceptable levels of poor air quality by incorporating design solutions that minimize increased exposure. Protecting and enhancing our network of open spaces so it can fulfill its full potential. Using, where appropriate, development as a potential enabler or facilitator of improvements, and that certainly will be the subject of your next meeting, where we'll be bringing forward examples around that debate. Maximising urban greening through developing a specific urban greening factor for the borough, and again we'll cover that at the next meeting. Protecting allotments and encouraging provision of space for community growing, as Trevor mentioned, and steering developments to areas with the lowest probability of risk from flooding. We can have the next slide, please. And the last major area of interest is around waste management, achieving self-sufficiency in waste management through identifying sufficient sites and capacity for waste management facilities, whilst prioritising facilities which meet minimum greenhouse gas performance standards and supporting the principles of the circular economy. We can move on to the next slide, please. So that's the sort of broad overview of some of the areas where the local plan can make a difference. I wanted to concentrate the rest of the presentation really on carbon in particular, and just sort of set out some of the issues here, because as has already been described by other speakers, buildings account for a significant proportion of the borough's carbon, and therefore improving the energy performance of buildings is clearly obviously a central objective. At present, a number of policies operate both regionally and locally which seek to reduce carbon emissions, and these all rely on the building control regulations. Now, whilst on paper those targets appear to be stretching, requiring both major residential and now non-residential development to be zero carbon, in practice we feel they fall somewhat short of this ambition. In particular, whilst the London Plan has a policy requiring zero carbon target schemes to achieve 100% improvement beyond the 2013 standard in the building regs, the GLA's energy guidance only requires developments to achieve a minimum 35% reduction in on-site regulated carbon emissions. So it's a bit of a loophole, if you like, and permits the remaining percentage, closing the gap up to 100%, to be met off-site. And this is this concept that planning committee members will be very familiar with, called offsetting Section 106 contributions. Now, in Ealing, the contribution is currently calculated using the GLA's established carbon price of £95 per tonne, and the council currently pools that money and uses it to invest in carbon saving projects off-site, including, for example, retrofitting works to existing council-owned buildings or stock. Now, whilst the policy permits offsetting and the schemes funded are indeed worthy, the policy objective should be about maximising, in my view, the on-site improvement. It's far more preferable, and it's less ideal to displace the responsibility of carbon offsetting from new buildings to existing buildings, particularly when the new buildings will be likely to be around for much longer. Experience of applying the policy to date shows that established carbon price of £95 is too cheap, and as a consequence it hasn't incentivized applicants to exceed the 35% on-site improvement, as it's significantly cheaper to pay the offsetting contribution than to incorporate the equivalent percentage savings on site. Next slide, please. So recognising those concerns, Ealing, along with a number of other London boroughs, including Barking, Greenwich and Haringey, commissioned a study to examine the role of carbon pricing to incentivise greater savings on site. And we got some expert external consultants, LETI, originally known as the London Energy Transformation Initiative, that was established in 2017 to assist with this. And LETI is a voluntary network of over 1,000 built environment professionals, and they get a lot of support and input from the GLA, from local authorities generally, and indeed other organisations. And so we asked LETI to examine a range of options and for driving further carbon reductions on site through price, through policy, and through the process. Next slide, please. So the study looked at a range of different building typologies common to the participating boroughs to understand what measures are technically achievable in the pursuit of achieving zero carbon buildings and the associated cost of implementing such measures to achieve different levels of building performance. And whilst the results vary somewhat between typologies, the results show a 60% improvement beyond building regulations can be achieved with modest intervention and cost, and as a consequence of the decarbonisation of the grid, for some specifications, an even greater improvement over the building regulations achieved at no extra effort or cost to the developer at all than they would have been previously deployed to achieve the baseline in the London Plan of 35%. So in effect, 60% should represent the sort of new 35% baseline threshold. If we have the next slide, please, Seba. And this, I actually can't see the slide on screen, but this attempts to show how that methodology would impact on a particular building typology. In this case, it's a mid-rise apartment building, to show the relative improvement in performance in terms of carbon saving. Next slide, please. And again, these then provide some figures on that. So whilst there is clear scope to secure greater on-site improvements, offsetting would still be required to cover any remaining shortfall. And so the study, having examined the cost of securing the equivalent savings off-site, suggests that a much higher price of £300 per tonne be determined to enable this. So it's a marked difference from the £95 per tonne that is currently being levied. Next slide, please. So having established what can be reasonably achieved on site and the costs associated with delivering improvements off site, the study recommends the introduction of a tiered pricing structure, which has been priced to compel applicants to increase the on-site improvements well beyond the current 35% minimum set by the GLA. We have the next slide. So how do we take this forward? So the opportunity is obviously to do so directly in the local plan or through a supplementary planning document, which is guidance that supports the local plan. My view is that clearly, obviously, if we put a price in the plan, we're then stuck with that until we do another local plan review. So I think it's probably more advisable to have that figure in guidance, which is more easily updatable, but that we have a very clear policy hook in the local plan. So we would certainly want to set a much higher target for the minimum on-site reduction in carbon, 60% up from the 35% in the London plan. And, you know, as I said before, whilst the London plan is really important, it's part of our local plan, and we must be in general conformity with the London plan, as we did with our existing adopted local plan, we are able to set more taxing, more demanding targets, providing the evidence base supports that. So we're working very closely with, as I say, a range of London boroughs so that we have an approach that is supported by a range of different local authorities across London. And of course, we're also trying to seek to persuade the mayor, when he next reviews the London plan, to also take a more radical stance in this area. If we take the next slide, in fact, the one after that, and the one after that, sorry. And the last thing I just wanted to say was about strategic flood risk assessment. So the council has already, in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework, undertaken a strategic flood risk assessment to understand the flood risk in the area, both now and in the future, taking account, of course, of the impacts of climate change. So the SFRA is a tool that we use in preparing a local plan. So it's a part of our sort of standard suite of evidence that is required to be undertaken. We have the next slide. And we've already produced what's called the Level 1 SFRA, which we produced in conjunction with neighbouring authorities in West London. That was published in May 2018. We adopted quite a unique approach in terms of zoning areas at risk to surface water flooding in a way that was compatible with the Environmental Agency's zoning of fluvial and tidal risks as well. And we've designed an interactive tool which is available on the website so that developers, landowners can make an assessment. The next stage, we'll commission this in the new year, will be to undertake what's called a Level 2 SFRA. So this is a more detailed, more specific site assessment of relevant sites that will be contained within the future site allocations element of the local plan to support any exception testing where appropriate between Regulation 18 and Regulation 19. I'll pause there, and I apologize for the interruption and for the fact that actually you'll get in the second hand that Ian would have been far more expert on some of the technical disciplines here. My apologies, councillors.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, I mean, the second half of the presentation after the break, it seemed to be okay. At least I could hear it okay. So I hope other members of the committee could. The first part, unfortunately, was less clear, but at least we could see the slides. There's some interesting points there. So I wonder who wants to ask questions. Can I just ask one myself first, just for a bit of clarification? The carbon offset prices that are being used, are all London boroughs currently using the GLA price, or are there any that have started to use their own price?
My understanding is everyone is using the GLA. Sorry, I'm getting feedback. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, I'll start again. Sorry about that. My understanding is, yes, we're using the existing GLA London Plan policy. As I say, that was only published back in March of this year. But as I say, working together with 4 other London boroughs, we're looking to set our own separate independent price. And of course, there's lots of other boroughs who weren't party to that particular piece of evidence-based work who are watching very closely the work that we and others are doing, and I would hope we'll follow suit. But as I say, the evidence that we've so far compiled is, I think, very compelling, and is suggesting that we should be.
I think we've lost you again, Steve. Okay, I can see a few people want to ask questions, but Steve has disappeared. Okay, let's hope he's back soon. I don't know what's happened to Ian. He seems to have disappeared completely. So.
That's Steve coming back in.
Good. Yes. Okay, Steve. Sorry. Yeah, you were just cut off there. You were. I think you were almost finished. Did you?
Apologies, really frustrating. So all I was going to say at the end there, I don't know how much you heard, was obviously the flaw with the existing London Plan policy is it allows offsetting. And it's cheaper, therefore, for developers to pay the offsetting Section 106 contribution than it is to actually bring forward genuinely net zero developments for new buildings, and I think that is a loophole, if you like, in the existing London plan policy. So we want to close that as part of the local plan and set a pricing strategy which incentivizes developers to actually come up with a net zero proposal or something which is closer to net zero, and not use that loophole to just pay us cash instead, which of course we would use for things like retrofitting and things like that. But of course, we're not achieving the ultimate objective of the policy. That was the point I was trying to make, possibly not quite so eloquently the second time.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, well, I can see
no.
3 hands up. If hopefully Steve's still there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah. I've got Councillor Ball, Councillor Burke, and Councillor Shaw. So, Councillor Ball.
Yeah, so it's really a question of timing. I mean, I think if I'm right in saying, I think the cabinet agreed, at the political level, that we should have a higher carbon offset price. And Steve was saying that it could be done by supplementary planning documents rather than in the plan, so that it's more flexible to change. But what's the timescale? How quickly can we increase beyond the current amount, which everyone agrees is insufficient?
Okay, good question. Are you receiving us, Steve? Is he there? Okay, his name is still on the screen. Oh no, okay.
He's gone, I think.
Yeah. Is Ian there? I notice his name has reappeared.
Chair, it's Jo Mortensen. I know, because I've been involved in the study with Ian, that the plan is to, in terms of a timeline, to create the SPD within the year. It was really down to resources being available, because it's collided with the local plan creation. So we have all of the information that we need, and it's really just about following through with the process.
Okay, Steve, are you back?
I am. I don't know for how long. I'm sorry, I keep dropping out.
The question was how soon can we get the SPD done? Really, with
that's a really good question. I'm not sure who asked that. Was that John Ball? So yes, a really good question. I mean, we would certainly want to move as quickly as we can, but obviously by doing a joint evidence base, you are probably working at the pace of the slowest. So we are probably the sprinters in the pack, if you like, wanting to go faster. There is obviously danger in being the first to stick your head above the parapet to a certain extent. So I think there is benefit in a more collaborative approach to this, and in particular the choice of the boroughs who are involved in the collaboration was designed to ensure that we have a broad range of building typologies across London, so that if developers were to challenge the policy either in the examination process or in a future planning appeal, we have a stronger, more robust evidence base to support the policy lever that we're promoting. So some debate, some discussion taking place between the boroughs who are involved in the project about timing. As I say, I think we will certainly want to put something in the Reg 18 draft local plan that we publish in the summer of next year, with obviously members' support. The issue for me is how best you deal with the issue of the pricing concept, whether that should be directly in policy or whether or not you just deal with a percentage and therefore update that in guidance. Because what you won't want to have is the policy fossilizing over time, so that we're still always responding and still providing maximum incentive to the development industry to do net zero on site where possible.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Councillor Burke now.
Steve, it's the sort of similar question I keep asking. So again, it's weighing it's the timing of this in terms of how do we stop ourselves having said yes to an awful lot of building, either in pre-planning or actually gone through. And then this comes in a bit too late to stop all that happening. So how do we make sure that we're not kind of implementing this after the horse has bolted? That's the first question. And the second one is, again, in terms of the metrics, I was a little unclear about how many things we will have metrics for and by when and how they're worked out, because there's an awful lot of things in there that could be measured.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, Councillor Burke. I mean, clearly, obviously, any new emerging policy doesn't have the full weight, until the plan is formally adopted. So, of course, that won't be on our current timetable till 2023, the earliest. Obviously, that's frustrating for all of us because we want to obviously see the new policies based on the evidence that is emerging implemented earlier. Obviously, a new policy, if we publish something in the summer of next year, so we plan to do a Reg 18, it will have some weight, so it's something which we can immediately refer to. And certainly, the stronger the evidence that we can wield to support that, working, as I say, collaboratively with a number of other London boroughs, the better that position will be. But you're absolutely right. You're not going to get the full weight of the policy until the plan is adopted and has been through the public inquiry and several rounds of consultation. But it gets more weight the more consultation that we do. So certainly something which I would be encouraging planning committee members to be referring to and using in their assessments once we publish in the summer from next year. But you may well find that some developers will be quite happy to comply with that. Others may challenge the basis for that policy, and you could end up with unintended consequences.
So, am I right in thinking, Danny, when we publish this in the draft of the local plan, we will have this new pricing schedule for the carbon offset charges as well?
The intention would be to have something alongside that which we can refer to and start to use immediately. But
that would be the SPD, yeah.
Either an SPD or we will put something in policy in draft. Or we'd have a percentage which would refer to a formula which would be in an evidence base. So we'd have something which we could work on. But as I say, in answer to Councillor Burt's question, the issue then is the weight that we can give that as a decision maker, as planning committee or as delegated to officers. It's not going to have the full weight and force of an adopted policy.
Okay. So we probably wouldn't be able to compel developers.
Ian is back in the meeting, so he may have a slightly better take on that because he's close to detail. Ian, if you're able.
Hi, hello. This is Ian Weaker. I apologies. I've had a lot of IT issues, and thank you, Steve, for doing a fantastic job of covering my presentation. Just in terms of the questions, and I think our preference would be to try and this was part of the kind of rationale for the approach we took in relation to the study, which was to try and look at a way in which we could give effect to a change now, so to increase on-site emissions, and the intention was to try and do that through the pricing. And the advantage of doing it through the pricing as opposed to doing it through the policy is that the price sits outside of the policy, so the price is set through or we're advised through the Mayor's own SPG on sustainable design and construction that the price can be set independent of the policy, and that we can set that locally through an SPD. So, and obviously it's quicker and easier for us to do that through an SPD. So obviously that's a clear advantage. But I think the intention nonetheless though would be to complement that by also setting minimum on-site standards through the policy itself. So and some of the other authorities that we've been kind of working kind of developing this concept with have started to look at those. So for example, Merton, they're looking to introduce a minimum on-site target of 60% for domestic residential schemes and 50% for non-domestic. So they are effectively looking to raise that minimum on-site requirement, which is currently set through the London Plan Policy SI2. So, and they're obviously looking to do that through their local plan. So, and I think they were at a slightly more advanced stage with their local plan at the time. So, rather than doing that, rather than going down the SPD route, I think they felt that it was better to do that through the policy itself. So I think essentially we would probably look to do both and try and get the best of kind of both worlds. Just in terms of the question Councillor Burke asked around the kind of metrics, I think one of the other things we want to explore, and one of the other kind of recommendations arising from the study, well, there's actually a number of other recommendations arising from the study, one of which was to consider whether or not the policy target in the London plan, whether or not that actually represents a kind of genuine or true zero carbon position. And the reason I say that is because it principally only deals with what's called regulated emissions or regulated energy, which is the emissions arising, which are controlled through kind of fixed systems and are controlled through building regulations. What it doesn't deal with is all the other emissions. So there are two types. There's unregulated, which is all your appliances and so on, and then the kind of non-operational stuff, which is all the emissions associated with, I suppose, the kind of embodied energy and emissions associated with kind of materials and kind of construction of buildings and developments. So I think one thing we would like to, and we know that the non-regulated and non-operational emissions in some cases can account for more than half of total emissions arising from development. So it is significant aspect of our emissions. So I think what we want to do is to look at perhaps redefining what we mean by zero carbon for the purpose of testing the policy, and obviously that's something we want to look at through our new local plan policy. Thanks.
Okay, well, good. Thanks, Ian. I think that last point answers some of the questions that were raised earlier, kind of in the evening, about how we deal with sort of embedded emissions and those sort of things that aren't covered in planning policy at the moment. So what you're saying is that we would look to be covering precisely those things in our policy.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that exactly be the case. Yes.
Okay, that's great. I think that's exactly what we want to hear, really. Okay, well, Councillor Shaw had a question as well. So, Councillor Shaw.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's on the theme of the pricing. I mean, obviously, in a way, I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate here, but just to check where we are with it. Clearly the pricing isn't working. Jo has made that clear in her presentation, that it's too easy for developers to pay that. By changing the pricing or putting in indicative pricing and doing it alone and sticking our heads above the parapet, as Steve has indicated, there is the risk that effectively there's a market develops across London in terms of low carbon building, and attracting it or not attracting it via the pricing policies. So what work has been done? I know, Steve, you mentioned, for example, that the other boroughs that were working with us in commissioning the Letty research was covering all the housing typing. But what about, sort of neighbouring boroughs working together with this to come up with their own pricing sort of structures and where it'd be? So, for example, if we went £300 a tonne that you've used, what if sort of Hounslow, for example, just say, oh well, do you know what, we're going to cut ours, and actually, we'll charge £50 a tonne. here and try and attract in more development that way? Is there a danger that we price ourselves out on some sites where we urgently need development and we can't do it ourselves as an authority?
Okay, I guess either Ian and or Steve, who wants to pick that up.
I'm happy to try and answer that, Chair. It's a very good point. I suppose what is key with the approach is that a successful policy is not one where we are securing lots of money. That isn't the purpose. So we're not pricing it in a way in order to increase the pot of money we're collecting. It's there, purely to encourage developers to go down an alternative route, which is an alternative and cheaper route, which is to implement those measures and make those improvements on site. So what we hope is that developers in most instances won't have to pay the highest tier in terms of the pricing, because they'll want to avoid doing that, and they'll choose the cheaper option of doing it on site. But what we know at the moment is, though, that pricing at £95 per tonne is just far too cheap, basically. And we also know that to achieve, if we take the money and then try to invest that off-site and achieve those savings off-site, that £95 isn't going to get us anywhere close to what we need, and we need somewhere in the region of around £300 per tonne in order to deliver equivalent savings off-site. Just to say as well, we had the original group that came together in terms of the authorities. There's obviously quite a kind of broad mix geographically across London, but I actually think that's been quite advantageous. It includes inner London authorities, it includes outer London authorities, obviously with different land values and so on, and I think that's been an advantage. We have shared obviously the work we've done with colleagues in West London through the West London Alliance, and obviously we're quite keen to to see whether or not there is scope to bring this forward collectively, whether at West London level or elsewhere. We've also obviously shared the findings with the GLA as well, so we're quite keen for them to endorse the recommendations, and we obviously encourage them to revisit their own pricing that they advise at a regional level as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ian. That's very helpful. Okay, well, we do have another presentation, so we'd better move on quickly. So it is Michael Thornton from the Heathrow Strategic Planning Group. So I hadn't heard of the Heathrow Strategic Planning Group before, but apparently I'm sure Michael can tell us a bit about them. But just in case anyone is interested, then they're not a campaign group that's campaigning for Heathrow expansion or campaigning against Heathrow expansion. Just in case someone was wondering, they take a sort of neutral stance on that. But anyway, Michael, it's over to you. So perhaps you can give us the benefit of your presentation, please.
Can you see the slides?
I can see the slides, yeah.
Grand, okay. How long have we got?
Okay, if you could keep it to sort of 10 minutes, as the original sort of 10 minutes, yeah, and then we'll just sort of, yeah.
Okay, so
I mean, less than 10 minutes, that would be great. But,
right. So what I was going to cover is who HSPG are, which will help you with your query, Chairman, and why we're here, what we do. Talk a little bit about some of the recent activity. I was going to talk to you a little bit about the wider aviation policy context, but we'll skip over that given the time. And I'll come directly to your questions for the case study, which is, can Heathrow build back better and can it meet net zero carbon targets? And I'll close with just a little bit about HSPG's position. You have got quite full slides from me, so hopefully you can, you've read those already, or you can read those at your leisure. So time won't be too much of a constraint. First thing is, yes, we're entirely independent of Heathrow. They don't pay for me to be here, you do. The members who contribute to the running costs of HSPG include Ealing, Hounslow, then a number of the districts and boroughs outside of London, Surrey County, the LEPs covering the area. And you'll see in the graphic there, the small map there showing you the position of Heathrow and our membership. And then the larger map showing you the sort of core member area and that we're interested in. We've got very close working relationships with WLA, with aviation teams and rail transport teams at DFT, other government agencies. We have an open invite for Heathrow to participate, for Hillingdon and the Mayor of London to participate in our work. And we've been around since 2015, formed as a response to airport expansion, Ealing part of establishing the group initially. The point really in this, the point is, of course, that whilst the fence of the runway of the airport is entirely within the London Borough of Hillingdon, the public safety zones at the ends of the runways run into adjacent boroughs. The aircraft fly over yourselves and other surrounding districts. The economic functional area of the airport is much bigger than just Hillingdon. It straddles this wider area, as shown in the map. That sort of dotted circle you see there, that's a 5-mile radius. That's where the majority of the economic activity, directly and indirectly related to servicing the planes and the cargo and so forth, is taking place. It's a huge employer, as you know all about the impacts when the flying stopped. What we do is focus on the strategic issues, the cross-boundary issues where joint working makes sense. Don't try and do what is better done at borough level. We focus on the strategic. And fundamentally, we were formed to deal with the problem of planning for airport expansion and, of course, all the background growth in housing and employment demand that you know all about. Our membership includes authorities who are very much for, those who are very much against, and many who are ambivalent or go either way in terms of Heathrow expansion. But everyone sees the value in working together. I'm skipping a little bit here. Our focus has very much shifted with at the beginning of 2020, and we've been dealing with renewal and a sort of 2-runway future rather than the 3rd runway future. So a little bit more about that. Before March 2020, we did things like produce a joint spatial planning framework for the area we've been talking about, an economic development vision and action plan, sustainable access strategy work. So really fundamentally looking at how would a near doubling of airport be dealt with in terms of the local area. Since 2020, we've been really looking with a much reduced resource. We've been looking at how to, new opportunities, new ways of working. We've done a lot of work around COVID and COVID impacts and really trying to shape the recovery to build back better, build back greener, all those sorts of things. Those phrases we hear. Very much picking up the decarbonisation agenda, thinking both in terms of the energy infrastructure that would be necessary to serve an airport with the new types of engines that we hear about, hydrogen, electricity and so on, but also looking at decarbonisation of the airport and the sub-region and trying to do the two things in a joined up way. I'll move on from there quickly. Just quickly on, I mean, read this at your leisure, but aviation policy in the UK at the moment, it's the government's position that they support the Northwest Runway scheme. They've declined to change that policy in September, but officials are telling us that there will be what they're calling a flight plan issued in the new year, sort of setting out a programme for reviewing UK policy. We don't know where that will go. We do know it will reflect some of the decarbonisation of transport agenda, a document you may have heard about, Jet Zero strategy. It certainly will be looking at revised forecasts and appetite for flying, new international targets that might have come from COP26, but will come from further international agreements. I think it's probably fair to say that government policy tends to emphasise the benefits of technology and new innovation, new fuels, if you like, magic new solutions. The Climate Change Committee at Parliament and many others urge fundamentally to rein back demand for flying. Government obviously treading a tightrope here. With the sort of the open bullet points there, a couple of sort of comments from ourselves really on government policy. They need to give a lot more attention to the end-to-end parts of the flight, the impact of the airport on the ground, the supply chain to the airport. It's not just about the planes in the air. There's a lot of concern that the drive for decarbonisation will crowd out concerns for other types of polluting emissions and some of the other issues. And there are genuine tensions between, for instance, aircraft noise, reducing aircraft noise and reducing carbon emissions. There are real balances to be struck. We've got a major problem in terms of CAA regulation for the airport, just does not support the airport in decarbonising. It's just not joined up policy. And of course, HSPG have been arguing for things like Western Rail, Western Rail access, Southern Rail access, the orbital, West London orbital services to get into Heathrow. That money for infrastructure in our parts of the world is obviously seriously in question these days. Heathrow's response, obviously hugely hit by the pandemic, as you well know, but the impacts are different at every airport. For Heathrow, it's a hub airport. It's a very different beast to something like Gatwick or Stansted. So a third of the flights are actually transit flights. People arrive by plane and leave by a different plane. It serves long distance markets, particularly the US. So it's been hit in a particular way, and in fact, a particularly heavy way by the pandemic. Heathrow are forecasting not getting back to sort of 2019 levels until 27. And within that, change is inevitably going to happen. A third of flights at Heathrow were previously business flights. The appetite for business flying is changing because people are doing what we're doing now, much more. Certainly, there at the top, there is a recognition that things will change and that they won't go back to the sort of carbon high water mark we saw in the past. And absolutely that the aviation and the airport must decarbonise during the 2020s. Two sort of comments at the bottom there, really. I think there's increased appetite, recognition, value of working collaboratively on these things, but also, whilst we hear a lot of the right things, we need to keep the pressure on for better pace, scope, levels of engagement, higher levels of ambition. Can Heathrow build back better? Certainly, from the top, everything we hear is a clear recognition of the need to do different, to build back better. And we'll see some key documents coming out early next year, which will talk about this in terms of the next iteration of the recovery plan, a sustainability plan, and they'll be updating their target net zero plans. That'll be Q1 of next year. They appear to be addressing a good range of issues, and they maybe come and tell you about that at a later date. I think February is probably going to be more sensible timing to engage in that. What they're saying sort of appears to set well with the vision that HSPG has formed for the sub-region we talked about. But there's, as I said earlier, there's certainly areas where we're going to need to challenge and drive for more. In terms of can they hit the net zero targets, what is said at the top is a clear recognition and commitment, and some of that is promising. I think in terms of the tier 1, this is jargon, I'm afraid, but in terms of the direct impacts of the buildings and the energy consumption of the airport and the operations on the ground, tier 1, and their supply chain, what's known as tier 2, there seems to be very attainable that they can hit net zero. In terms of tier 3, which includes the aircraft in the air, and in terms of international accounting of these things, you count the outbound flight as belonging to the home country and their targets. Things are much more challenging, as you could expect. And aviation is driving towards net zero by 2050. What the things I think 2 points I'd stress here really is, there will be a continuing need for genuine carbon offsetting, and a way we're promoting for doing that is by something called insetting, which I'll come back to a moment. And this is principally necessary, not through any, principally because the new aircraft types and fuels like hydrogen electric are only really going to be rolled out in the next decade. So, there needs to be something done quickly to get on this net zero carbon trajectory. And the second thing I'd really stress is the importance of not losing the sight of all the other emissions and the other issues like night flying, noise emissions, habitat net gain, and so on. So what HSPG are pressing for, we're pressing Heathrow Airport Limited and pressing for collaboration around 2 things really at the moment, particularly to focus on. One is a sort of a sub-regional scale of energy planning, looking at the new infrastructure that's going to be necessary to serve that enormous consumption that we would see at the airport. You imagine fast charging aeroplanes and what that means for the electrical network, but also new types of fuel. But of course, the need to do that in a joined up way, serving local communities and industries at the same time. You can't serve an airport and everyone else have a brownout in terms of electrical. It needs proper planning. And the second thing is we're really looking at a sort of sub-regional scale of insetting. So those offsetting payments, rather than being spent on the other side of the world or a woodland in Scotland, for instance, we start investing those in carbon reduction measures in this locality that support the communities that are impacted by all the other consequences of the plane. Call it natural justice if you like, but bringing some of those offsetting of greenhouse gas emission mechanisms more locally. There's some 2 concluding points really. There's a huge prize there in both of those pieces of work, I think, but they're both enormously complicated and new. So there's a lot of work to be done, and they really do need to be done at scale in order to buy it. And secondly, we can only do this sort of work with your continued support, your continued financial support, along with the other authority members. So quick dash through my slides.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic, really. Really needs a much longer discussion. But so sorry, folks, we have slightly overrun our time. But if people aren't too desperate to dash off for their dinner, we can just spend a few minutes, I think, to round off the meeting. Do we have any any questions for Michael while he's here on that? Okay.
Right.
Sorry, was that someone saying they had got a question? Okay, no. Okay, thanks very much then, Michael. I mean, I noticed that you do have a website, because I looked it up earlier, although I didn't have much chance to look at it. So, I mean, I don't know if much of the sort of work that you've been doing is covered in information on your website, but
yeah, on the about five or six slides in, there was a link for the website there, so you can get all the documents are there. So yes, you can see what we do. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's great. So I'll certainly have a look at that, and I'm sure some of the other members of the committee will do so when they've got a bit more time. Okay, that brings the presentations to the end. Well, we have got a member of the public here, Will French, that wanted to ask a question. So I have, is Will still here? Okay, I had suggested to him that we might be pushed for time this evening, so maybe he would be better.
He's gone to another meeting.
Sorry.
He's left for another meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, I did extend to him the offer of raising the question at our next meeting, which is only in a few weeks. So I presume he will be back, and there'll be a chance to properly deal with his points then. But you know, I did tell him that we were going to be pushed for time this evening, as unsurprisingly we are. Okay. I think that's it then for this evening, everyone. So the next meeting is on December the 16th, and that will be covering green infrastructure. So really following on quite naturally from many of the topics that we've started discussing here. So hopefully I'll see most of you then. So, okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much. Good night.
See you at the next meeting.
Thanks very much.